All right, we are going to write sine and cosine equations given the graph. So what we need to do is figure out things like the period, the amplitude, and then whether something's been moved up or down, flipped over, that sort of thing. So this first equation, we've got our wave. That's what lets us know it's a sine or a cosine. You could actually use sine or cosine on any of these, but there's like an easy choice and a hard choice. Since this one actually goes through 0, 0, the easy choice is to say that this is a sine function. So we're going to use sine. So I'm going to write down here y equals, I'm going to leave a little space, and I'm going to write down sine. So when it goes through the origin like this, that looks like a sine function. That's easier to do. All right, so then if we are going to figure out what goes in front of sine, we've got to find the amplitude. So the x-axis is here. Amplitude is? 3. 3, good job. So I'm going to put 3 here. And then we've got to figure out the period. So it goes up and down and starts over right there. So that is a period of pi, and then the next pi, it starts over. So my period is pi. So I'm going to write t equals pi up here, but that's not what goes in the equation. We have to actually figure out, we called this b in the last lesson. So you take 2 pi divided by the period, which is pi, and that'll give you the number that goes in. So the pi's cancel and you get 2, and that's the number that goes with x. And then we just check to see if there's any reflections or translations. This one, since it starts at 0 and immediately goes up, it tells us that this is not a reflection because that's what sine normally does. At 0, 0, it goes up, and then it goes down afterwards. So this one's good. That's all I have to do. Okay, so if we go over to number 2, because we have they call this I think it's crest and trough are the words they usually use in science. Basically because the top of the wave is on the y-axis instead of sort of being mid-wave, the easy choice for this one would be to use cosine. If it's not starting through 0, 0, the easy choice is to use cosine. So I'm going to put y equals and have a cosine over here. And it's symmetrical with it being up above the x-axis right here in the middle. So that tells me there's not a reflection. If it started with the down part, then we'd know it was a reflection. So what is the amplitude for this one? Yes. 4. Dang it. So I'm going to put a 4 in front of the cosine. And then this one has the waves are pretty compressed. It starts here, goes all the way down, and it starts over right here. So from here to here, it completes a full cycle. And so that means that the period is pi over 2. All right, so to find the number that goes in the equation, we're going to take 2 pi, and instead of writing it as a fraction, I'm going to use a division sign, and divide by pi over 2. So we have to remember how to divide fractions. So I'm going to make this 2 pi over 1. It just stays the same. I change division to multiplication and flip over the second fraction. The pi's will cancel, and I'm left with 2 times 2, which is 4. So I'll put 4x in here. And if we look, this has not been moved up or down or anything weird like that, so we're good. All right. So the main thing I want you to get is if it's sort of mid-wave is at 0, 0, you don't have a crest or a trough at 0, 0. It's easiest to use sine. I could use cosine and say that it's been moved over, but that's a more complicated equation. If you have it mid-wave, like you're at the top of a wave or the bottom of a wave on the y-axis, then it's easier to use cosine. You could call it sine and say that it's been moved left and right, but that's more complicated. All right, so let's go down to number 3. So if I'm on the y-axis, it's not going through 0, 0. That tells me it's easier to use cosine. But one of the things I noticed, if I look back at this one, we had the crest, I sort of think of as a mountaintop on the y-axis. Here we've got the valley on the y-axis, which means this has been flipped upside down. That lets me know that there's going to be a negative out here in front of my amplitude. What's the amplitude on this one?
2.
2. So I'm going to have negative 2 out there. And then to figure out the period, I'm going to start here at this trough or this valley and see how long it goes before it's back in that position, which is over here. And that's happening after 2 pi. So the period is 2 pi. What's going to go in my equation we call b. And you always take 2 pi divided by the period, which happens to be 2 pi. And everything cancels to give us 1. So I can either write 1x or x with the cosine. Okay?
Wait, how did you figure it out? It was that negative?
It's because on the y-axis you sort of have the down part instead of the up part. I think of it as sort of being a valley instead of a mountain.
Yeah.
Like you're starting low instead of high. That tells you that it's been reflected.
Okay.
If you look at the original cosine function that we put with the parent graphs, you can kind of tell the difference. Okay, so number 4, on the y-axis it's going through 0, 0. That tells me it's going to be easiest to use sine. And the thing that's typical with sine, if we look back at the one we did before, it's typical after 0, 0 for it to go up before it goes down. If you see it going down immediately after the y-axis, that means it's been flipped. So I'm going to have a negative. And then what is that amplitude?
5.
5. So negative 5. And then can anybody tell me what the period of this one is?
2 pi.
So 2 pi is half of it. It's got the downward part.
Never mind.
And then another 2 pi to get the upward part. So 2 pi and 2 pi add together to give you 4 pi. And those are tricky because you have to go and actually add the pieces together to get a full wave function, whatever you want to call it. So my period is going to be 4 pi. So what I'm going to put in the equation is 2 pi divided by the period, which is 4 pi. Pi's cancel. 2 over 4 is 1/2. The way we usually put this in the equation, you can do 1/2 x, or you can just put the x over 2. And then there's no translations or anything else here. We're going to add that in later. And then we've got one more. Number 5 was messed up, so we're skipping to number 6. Would you guys say this is a sine or a cosine?
Cosine.
Cosine, why?
Because it doesn't go through the origin.
Yeah, it's not starting at the origin with its wave. It's very symmetric. Does it have a reflection?
No.
No. So I'm going to have a positive number. What's my amplitude? 2. So I'm going to have cosine, it's 2.
And then
And-
it's going to be half of it.
Yeah, and this is like half of my wave goes to 2 pi, and the other half's over here to 2 pi. So that means my period is 4 pi again.
Never mind, you're right.
And so we just went through that math up here, where we did 2 pi over 4 pi, so we know it's going to be half again. So we get x over 2.